Hello, and today we're going to be reviewing the Ryobi PCL811B Hybrid Whisper Series 12.5-inch 18-volt electric fan. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, starting off at the bottom of the tool, we have the base plate. The base plate is entirely made out of plastic and should be able to protect your fan from any wet surface you might set it on. Keep in mind that that's just a wet surface and not actual water, but it does seem to be a fairly decent design in that regard. Now, there are clear markings letting you know where you need to screw in screws or place nails in order to hang this from a wall or from a low-hanging ceiling, but unfortunately I don't think the plastic can really hold up to this over a long term because, well, as you can tell from the new fan I just showed in the image on the left, it's definitely gotten a little bit beat up and the mounting holes don't seem to be able to hold on to the screws anymore. So quite frankly, this is an area of the tool that could either use a harder plastic or a metal plate in order to keep it from, well, deforming over time. Something else that would be nice with this particular tool would be if it had a tripod mount hole, but unfortunately we did not get that, so that is something else that they could improve upon in the future. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on to the next feature on this particular tool. Okay, next up we have the dial for the different speeds and your on and off, obviously. Now, first up on the speed dial, we have number 3, and the 3 mode is going to be your highest speed and also going to be your loudest and the most power, consuming speed. It does a fairly good job at moving air fairly well, and it will definitely keep you cool if you're in a hot environment, especially if you're sitting in the shade. But by no means is this perfect because it's definitely going to use up the battery super fast, coming in at around 6 to 7 hours worth of runtime with a 4 amp hour battery. So, it's okay. Next up we have the second fastest speed, which is going to be speed level 2, and that's going to provide you with around 9 to 10 hours worth of runtime, and is definitely going to be a little bit more power efficient and a little bit quieter, but not moving nearly as much air. And of course, level number 1, which is going to be your slowest speed setting, which is going to give you a runtime around 23 to 25 hours worth of runtime, but is definitely moving very little air, but it is also the quietest. So depending on what your personal needs are, you do have quite a few different choices to choose from here, so that is probably a fairly good thing on a fan like this. So yeah, that's about the sum of it. I wouldn't say that this fan is super quiet, but it's also not super loud, so it gets a pass. With that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up we have the battery slot located on the rear of the tool. Now, the battery slot on this particular tool will accept any of Ryobi's 18-volt lithium batteries, and, it gets the job done. It is elevated slightly up at an angle, so you shouldn't have to worry about setting this on a wet surface and the battery getting wet, because it keeps the battery off the ground. Just remember, you cannot set it in a puddle. And, of course, if you choose not to use a battery with this particular fan, you do also have the option of being able to plug in an extension cord, as long as the extension cord will fit into the hole. So, a typical garden variety single slot extension cord should work just fine. If you have a 3-slot extension cord or an extension cord that has 3 different outlets on it, that won't work. It will have to be a single slot, extension cord. But as long as you keep that in mind, you shouldn't have any major issues. Now, the battery slot on this particular tool does have a little bit of play or looseness to speak of, but there is enough for me to be concerned, and I haven't had any issues with this particular fan dropping any batteries. So as far as I'm concerned, the battery slot and an AC power cord slot work just fine, and they get a pass from me. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the pivoting head. Now, the pivoting head on this particular fan works good enough out of the box, but there is something I'm a little bit concerned about. But first up, let's talk about how much you can pivot the head. Now, the head can be pivoted up to 160 degrees, which means you can basically have the fan head pointed straight up or down at quite a sharp angle, but not straight down because, well, the base would be in the way and that really would be kind of pointless. But you get the point. Now, the one feature on this particular pivoting head that I'm not a huge fan of is the fact that they decide to have the tensioning screws or the ability to adjust the tensioning of the head hidden away behind some permanent plastic covers that are not really easily removable without, well, destroying the cover, which is definitely a major downside because if you ever have if the head ever becomes loose, then you basically have no option except to, well, destroy the cover so you can access the tensioning screws, which I'm just not a huge fan of. The tensioning system out of the box is good enough to keep the fan in whatever position you have it set at, but I can see how in the future, over time, how this might become wore down or break in, and to the point where you will have to adjust the tensioning system, and unfortunately you have no ability to do that without destroying part of your tool, which is just a stupid design in my opinion. So this is something I would like to see changed upon in the future, and I honestly do like fans that have you know, a finger screw that you can easily adjust the tension in the field if you ever need to. Yes, sometimes you have to do that more often, but at least you have the option, whereas with this particular fan, you just don't have that option. So, you know, time will have to tell, but for me personally, I would have liked to have seen a more friendly, you know, user interface when it comes to tensioning the screw that you could easily access. So with that being said, let's move on. Okay, next up we have the front and rear grille, and it's a fairly good showing. Both the front and rear grille on this particular fan are made out of plastic and are fairly thick and aren't easily, you know, bendable or movable, and it should have no issue keeping kids' fingers out of the, well, fan blade or fan area on this particular tool. Now, something to keep in mind, however, is the fact that this particular fan does not feature any sort of easy cleaning function, which means that you won't be able to easily, you know, take it apart and, you know, wipe off the fan blades, or you know, throw the grills in the yard and wash it off with a hose, because, well, you can't separate it from the electronics, and the electronics can't get wet. So, you know, this just is not a rugged fan or an easily cleanable fan. So, you know, if you want to clean this fan, you're going to have to disassemble it with a screwdriver, and then you'll have to reassemble it at a later time, which may void your warranty. I'm unsure on that, but, you know, it's just something that you should keep in mind. You can't easily clean this particular fan, but the fan guard, rear and front, are both going to be very thick and durable, and you shouldn't have any major issues even if you were to drop this fan several times, as long as you haven't left it sitting out in the sunlight for years at a time where the sun has cooked the plastic and made it brittle. You know, out of the box it's very flexible and very durable, so, you know, shouldn't have any major issues as long as you're taking care of your tools. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on to the final part of the tool. Okay, last but not least, we have the carrying handle, and it's a fairly good showing here. It is a little bit on the small side, so if you have extra large hands, it might not be the most comfortable fit, but for people who have normal to smaller size hands, it's very usable, and it definitely will provide you with a firm or secure way of carrying this particular fan. The fan will keep working in pretty much any position, so you do have the option of having the fan run while you are carrying it. If that's any use to you, I don't know, but, you know, you do have that available option to do that. So with that being said, the carrying handle works just fine. It's made out of plastic, and it seems to be very durable, so really no complaints there either. So let's go ahead and move on to the weight of the tool. Okay, without a battery, the fan weighs 1,819 grams, which comes out to be right around 4 pounds. And with a 4 amp hour battery, it comes out to be 2,537 grams, which is about 5.6 pounds. Size-wise, it's very comparable to the Hart 7.5 inch fan, and quite frankly, you know, they're both made by TTI, so a lot of the DNA you can find in both of these fans is very, very similar. But I will say that the Ryobi is probably the better deal, because unlike the Hart fan, you can plug an extension cord into the Ryobi and run it for a much longer period of time. So quite frankly, it really does come down to your own personal needs, but between these two different fans, I would definitely pick the Ryobi over the Hart fan, just because of the ability to plug the power cord into it. And you also have an additional power level option that you can choose from. But that's not to say the Hart fan isn't a bad fan either. You know, when it comes down to it, both these are, you know, pretty good 7.5 inch fans, and they get the job done, and so they're both adequate. But for me personally, I prefer the Ryobi over the Hart, just because of the AC capability that it's able to, you know, use. So, you know, it is what it is. Now, when you compare it against a larger Ryobi fan, say their larger misting fan, it is also a, you know, it's a different beast completely to that particular larger fan. And, you know, the smaller Ryobi fan is much more portable, much lighter, and overall is probably going to be much more durable and can survive a couple of falls, unlike the larger Ryobi fan, which does have a tendency of tipping over because the base on it just isn't wide enough. So, you know, there's pros and cons here. The larger Ryobi fan really is meant to be more in a, you know, permanent position, or at least, you know, staying at your house, whereas the smaller Ryobi fan is something that's more designed to take places and be used on the go. So, you know, it comes down to your own personal needs. You know, at the end of the day, I think I prefer the smaller Ryobi fan over the larger Ryobi fan, just because of the power consumption level being lower on the smaller Ryobi fan than the larger Ryobi fan. But it doesn't have the misting capability, so it really comes down to what your own personal needs are in that particular situation, or whatever situation you're buying for. So, you know, it is what it is. And then if you compare the battery topper fan against the 7.5 inch fan, they're both actually fairly similar in their capabilities. Their speeds are about the same. I think the 40 volt topper fan has a little bit more focused wind speed, and so it works really well for cooling down tools or drying out moisture from your phone charging port when water gets in there accidentally. And so, I think it has its purposes, but the larger one definitely does a better job at cooling off a human versus, the smaller topper fan. Not that the topper fan can't do that, but the larger one is definitely a little bit more, capable in that regard. So, size-wise, there's definitely quite a size difference. The smaller Ryobi topper fan is going to be able to be much more compact and have a much longer runtime because it's utilizing a 40-volt battery. But when you consider the weight, they're probably going to have fairly similar weights. So, it comes down to what your own needs are and what you're capable of transporting. So, it is what it is. But with that being said, let's go ahead and recap with the pros and cons. Okay, first up we have 18 volt. 18 volt means that this will work with all your Ryobi 18 volt lithium batteries, and if you so choose to, you can adapt batteries over from other brands via third-party adapter. Just remember, if you do that at your own risk. And the next pro would be 3 power levels. Having 3 different power levels means that you'll be able to find an option that suits your needs and helps you conserve battery life when you need to, well, have the fan last more than, say, 7 hours. So, this is a pro in my opinion. AC power. Being able to plug this fan into an AC cord means that you'll get a much longer runtime, and you won't have to worry about depleting a battery if you need it in another location. So in my opinion, this is a pro. Fairly quiet. This is a part of Ryobi's Whisper series, and while I don't think it's exactly the quietest fan in the world, it is much quieter than a lot of other fans on the market, and definitely seems to be way quieter than the noisy, clunky Holmes fans or, Honeywell fans that always seem to start making mechanical noise about 2 weeks after the return window closes. So in my opinion, this is a pro. And the next pro would be the carrying handle. The carrying handle allows you to transport this fan fairly easily, and it also gives you another point where you can tie a strap or something to it if you need to hang it from a different position. So in my opinion, this is a pro. And the next pro would be runtime. Getting about 7 hours of this particular fan on high with a 4 amp hour battery is pretty good and should be able to get you through most of your workday. So quite frankly, this is another pro in my opinion. And the first myth would be the wall mount holes. Unfortunately, the wall mount holes, while it is fairly well designed and they definitely give you the appropriate measurement spots, they just don't seem to hold up all that well over time, and this is an area of the tool I think could use some improvement in the future. And the first con would be no tension adjustment. I really like having a tension adjustment knob, and the fact that this doesn't have it gives me a little bit of hesitation about its long-term capabilities, especially if those tension points start to get loose over time. So in my opinion, this is a con, not having the tension adjustment knobs. And another con would be that there's no tripod mount. Yes, it doesn't necessarily need a tripod mount, but I really do like having tripod mounts on fans because it allows you to set them up in different ways and in different situations that you wouldn't typically be able to set a fan up in. So in my opinion, this is something that would make this fan vastly more capable, and it's something I hope that they add on a future model. And another con, in my opinion, is the fact that it's hard to clean. Unfortunately, the grills are not easily removable, and it's very hard to get to the fan blade without having to remove, well, all the screws. So in my opinion, this is an area that the fan could be improved upon in future models. And the last con would be price. Unfortunately, this particular fan, it retails for about $60 tool only, and that's a lot of money for a 7.5 inch fan. That's 3 times the amount of money that you're going to probably be paying for a box fan, or at least 2 times the amount of money that you'll be paying for a box fan. And quite frankly, this just doesn't have a lot of capabilities that even third-party tools off of Amazon from sketchy sellers are capable of doing, like charging your phone or giving you a light source when you're camping. Those can be super useful, and quite frankly, even though that it's a smaller fan, you'll end up paying less. So that is another area on this particular fan that could use some innovation, in my opinion. Not that this fan is horrible, I just don't think that it's well worth $60. So with that being said, I do think that this is a con. And that is it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this particular fan. Overall, I think it's a very durable, very powerful, and a very effective little fan. However, I do think that it is overpriced, and I don't think it's worth $60. If you can find it on sale or during Ryobi days where it comes with 2 batteries and a charger for $100, that might be a little bit more doable. But on its own, at the $60 price point, it just is a little bit too much in the way of, well, cost. So, in my opinion, this tool comes recommended if you can buy it on sale or with other, add-on options to make it a better value. So, with that being said, we will see you all next time, and God bless.